Hello, everyone. This is Louis Maldonado, and I'm joined today by Gagan Prakash, and both of us are on the product management team for Amazon Detective. We're real excited today to give you an introduction and tell you a bit more about the service, and hopefully give you some more insight into how you might apply this service into your security team operations today. So with that, let's get started. Quick agenda for today. We're going to start with an introduction, tell you a bit about the why we built the service, just some context that might help you understand the perspective that we have in creating this new service. And after that, we're going to go into a bit of how it works, a little bit of under the hood, followed by a demo. And I think this is where hopefully it all comes together and you get to see the console and see how that works. And once we go through the demo, we're going to have Gagan come through and talk to you a bit about some of the details of the service and some of the aspects like pricing, etc. So that's our agenda for today. Obviously, at the end, we will take live questions. We'll be watching for them along during the session in the chat room. So please submit your questions, and at the end, we'll go through those as well. All right, without further ado, let's get started. So as we talk to a lot of organizations, and the security team specifically within these organizations, we really got a good sense of some of the challenges the security teams have in the incident response sort of areas of their practice. And over, we kept hearing this common theme around the investigation aspect of incident response. So just to back up, and you think about what it takes in these teams, any particular signal, any detection, any finding, alerts, these all could end up becoming something that the teams need to respond to. And so when it comes to actually understanding each one of those issues, you can imagine that that specific part of the process of investigation is something that they want to make very optimized. And so we understood, kind of the different perspectives. We spoke with small organizations with few number of people. We've spoken with large organizations with large SOCs and full structures in place. And these themes were just very common. And the first is really around that idea of how many alerts and how much signal they were really getting. The challenge often is for organizations is that with many detections, especially as you're putting more and more instrumentation into your organization, you're going to just naturally see more signal come up. And that could present a challenge for teams that would really like to understand every single one of those signals. You really would need to have a pretty optimized process to investigate if you were to really chase those down. And what really happens instead is that customers aren't chasing those down because they just cannot. So this is really a challenge, and that it's almost kind of a dichotomy of adding more detection and adding more signal causes more problem down the line. Now, certainly complexity plays a role. Our organizations that we spoke to are often hybrid organizations, or they have very involved infrastructures, even in just if most of their infrastructure is deployed on AWS. So this complex structure that they're maintaining means that it's very difficult for the security analysts to understand and know everything about the deployments. And so this makes it very challenging for them to keep up at the pace of development of many of their development teams. So these organizations are challenged to understand the context of, should I be expecting these things to happen? Is this normal behavior or not? It's a constant battle to try to keep that up to date. So certainly how your deployment infrastructure is structured plays a role, but also just the rapid pace that it's evolving. Now, it goes without saying that in this space, people who understand and are able to really respond to incidents and respond to detections are certainly not easy to find, right? We do have a skills shortage. This has been noted in many different places, and it's no different in our customers here at AWS, where we are adding additional understanding needed of our security operations teams that may have come up through an on-premises environment. Now they find themselves having to learn what it means to investigate and understand issues that are found in an AWS environment. And so this constant shortage is added to, if you think about the skill sets that are needed to continue to evolve, this can be a real problem for organizations in finding the right person to help with these investigation areas. And finally, sort of from the business side, some of these challenges I just mentioned translate into costs. So that means that in order to really provide the amount of data that's needed, provide the right type of tooling that's needed, bring it all together so that it's digestible, you're looking at significant cost often. And that could mean everything from how you put together and store and manage all the data that's needed, how much and how long do you store that data for, what kind of infrastructure do you use to query it. It's a number of different costs that are involved. And so all of these things together are really what are challenging our customers today in the area of investigation. And we really felt we could make this better. The incident response lifecycle, it certainly involves a number of other systems, and you're going to hear us talk about how we believe the capabilities we're addressing really fit into those existing workflows. But when we really dial into the investigation area, we know we can do better. So it's with that we launched Amazon Detective. And for those of you who may have been following, we've launched Detective at reInvent this past year in 2019, and it's currently in preview as of this webinar. So the idea of Detective is really to help our customers quickly analyze and investigate these security issues and identify what's going on. And the approach we're taking is thinking about those hard problems that I just mentioned, the challenges that our customers are having. We went after the key points that needed addressing. There's certainly a data aspect of it, and being able to manage that data collection seemed like a great goal. Also, providing automation wherever possible. How can we help the shortage of, the skill shortage and the, kind of expertise aspect, as well as the complexity problems? What can we do to automate some of that analysis capability? And then finally, making it visually something that all analysts can do. So it's not just about solving the hard problems, but making sure that anyone could do this. So that's really what Amazon Detective is all about. And we're really excited to walk you through some of what this looks like and give you a sense of how this comes together. So the way I thought I'd start at least getting your minds around where this might fit for you is to talk about some of the use cases that Amazon Detective has been applied to. And these are common use cases we're seeing already with our customers. There's a few different levels of these types of use cases, and so broadly I've grouped them into three areas. The first is the notion of triaging, and this could be just trying to understand if some signal that you have, a finding from something like our system, like a guard duty, for example, one of our detective services, or maybe one of your partner or existing custom services alerts that you might have, is how do you understand whether that's a real true positive or a false positive, and really getting to that understanding quickly. So that's a class of use case, very common. We'll talk about that. Second is incident investigation. So if you have identified something, how do you go deeper and really dig out and root out what's really involved, what else is related, and understand the full scope of your incident before you take action. It's another area you're going to hear us talk about. And then the third is still an emerging over the past few years area of really proactive investigation, and then, colloquially known as threat hunting. But in this space, you don't necessarily have a signal. You're oftentimes you've got an idea, or maybe your signal is a threat intel report or some other data. So you want to go through and how do I go and discover something? So these are three areas where we see Detective certainly applying, and it applies in different ways. So I'm going to talk about the types of capabilities that we provide for each one of these cases. All right, let's start with the first use case, and this is actually one that many of our customers who are currently using services like guard duty and other detective services would find very pertinent, and that's the notion of triaging. Whether it's an alert or a finding, your goal is to really understand, is this true or a false positive? Is this something I care about or not? And just to get to that disposition, you have to ask a number of questions. So the types of questions that you ask, they sometimes can involve deeper views and deeper dives into data, but you really don't have that time. When it comes to a triage situation, the whole goal is to do this quickly. So if you need to know how much data was sent, if you need to know whether this was normal traffic or not, or just what happened before and after, those can take a lot of time. And in the triage scenario, time is of the essence. So this is a great example where using detective, you can get through these types of use cases very quickly, and in fact, allows you to do even more triage that you might have otherwise, left some of these findings untouched. Knowing when you can't touch them, you're probably prioritizing the ones that you can get through quickly, but maybe sometimes the real interesting issues aren't getting touched because you feel like you just can't, you don't have the time to get to them. So we want to make sure you don't feel that way. It's a great example, and I'll show you some ways that the detective will help with a specific triage use case in our demo. Now, let's say you do find a true positive. What do you do when you need to go a little bit deeper? At this point, you might decide you have to start scoping the incident out. You really need to understand who was related, what was involved, and the types of questions might get a bit deeper, because it's not just at a level of, is this normal or not? Now you're starting to ask, well, what APIs exactly were made? And what types, what does that activity indicate? Does it mean that there was just one of my users interacting with my systems, or was it someone, a bad actor that's actually running reconnaissance exercises to understand how they might get in? What principles did they use? Was something compromised? What other instances were related? These are the types of deeper questions where many times it involves going deeper in terms of data sets, but it certainly involves trying to stitch together stories and correlate data and correlate it across dimensions that are not always set up for the analyst to easily to accomplish. So we're going to talk about some of those, and you're going to see how Amazon Detective really brings a lot of that work together as well. And then I mentioned the threat hunting use case. I think there's a range of threat hunting approaches that we've seen over the years emerging. They can be from the simple ones, such as got an indicator from a report, and you just want to find out has this bad IP ever communicated with any of my instances? Even just getting some of those basic questions answered oftentimes get in the way of a threat hunter really providing great value in understanding an area that was untouched by a detection infrastructure. So those are the kind of questions that you'll see value in the detective case, being able to help the threat hunter and saying, here's some questions, and if you want to chase down a hypothesis that you have about a user agent, about an instance that you're seeing, there's some great content that we can help with as well. So hopefully that gives you a sort of the class of problem, and I imagine that you're thinking through your own organization. You may be dealing with maybe more of one of these cases than others, but maybe there's a sprinkling of these as well. And so as I go through the demonstration and we talk more about how we're doing it, you probably find ways that we might be able to help in different aspects across your org. All right, so let's talk about how it works. Just very much at a high level here, we're going to talk about the processing flow to give you a sense of what can you expect as you turn on Detective in your accounts. The first thing is that I mentioned earlier, we wanted to hit those heavy, hard problems, and oftentimes just dealing with lots amount of telemetry data is a tough one, and that's really where it starts. So in our system, we automatically collect telemetry from AWS sources for you, and I'm going to talk about the specific ones, but there isn't anything that you need to turn on. You just turn on Detective, and we're going and pulling those data sources for you. So that's one of the first major benefits, I think, for those of you who currently are extracting out and or storing different types of logs from different services. Sort of a nice switch to be able to say, I don't have to worry about those components in order to get the benefit of Detective and the telemetry that we provide. So once we've collected that data, we then aggregate it. And our goal in aggregation is to make it easy to access, especially in the perspective of your security analyst. So we often see common and alternative approaches being log tools and databases, where oftentimes there's a little bit of work. You certainly can get there for your analysts, but there's a bit of work to get them the right schemas or the right setup so that they can quickly answer questions and also do it effectively with the right time consistency and cost of putting those together. So we'll talk a bit about in a second about how we do this. You can note here it is a graph-based approach, so I'm going to talk a bit about the graph model. But once we've aggregated it, we're not just stopping there the first time. This data is arriving constantly, so we are continuously aggregating this model, and it will continue to grow, and it becomes a picture, almost a living picture of what's happening in your system. And it's with that picture that we can then start running our analytics on. And this is what I mentioned at the beginning, where we're looking for every place where we can help automate the sort of heavy lifting that your analysts might be going through, especially in the analytics area where they might be trying to understand patterns and see trends. Those are the types of analytics that we can do. You can imagine, and I'm sure many of you are experiencing them, that this can be tough to do at scale. So as you add more and more data and you look for a longer retention rate for that data so that you can see better trends and baselines, running those analytics on your own can be pretty tough. And certainly not every organization has the data science capabilities or the technical approaches to be able to apply that. So we're really hoping we can help out with the teams that don't. And then finally, we visualize. And that means we present what we are showing in the graph as well as the results of these analytics in very simple and easy to consume methods that allow the analyst to answer those questions almost out of the box and then run around through the interface to understand other aspects and might link them to another idea and be able to go answer another question. So that visual approach is very console heavy. You're going to see us show the console and how it's used. But that's a key way that we allow the investigators to really move through the data, if you will, at a very rapid pace. So that's the high-level processing flow, just so you get a sense of how these things come together. Now let me talk a bit about each one of these, some of these areas. All right, let's start with that first step, which is telemetry collection. In this step, basically, we're gathering the observations and evidence of activity in your accounts. And Detective is, by nature, a multi-account service. So that means for each region in which you want to collect data, and we are a regional service, but in each one of these regions, you designate the accounts where you want us to collect telemetry. We call these the member accounts, sort of the accounts that you're monitoring. And you also designate an account where you want to aggregate the data, and this is the master account, and that's where the graph is going to live. And I'll talk about the graph in just a moment. So for those of you familiar with GuardDuty's master member approach, our telemetry collection approach is very similar. So data will be flowing from each of these accounts and we'll be grabbing them and bringing them together. What's a little different though is that you can have multiple aggregation points in Detective. So let's say you have different use cases for bringing certain accounts together in a certain way. You want to monitor a specific business unit or maybe a separate property. You'd like to treat these differently. You can also have multiple accounts contribute to multiple aggregations or multiple graphs. So this is a great way of setting up almost a federated monitoring environment. So you can have a small local view as well as a global view. So in any case, we try to give you some flexibility. It allows you to bring these various views into the accounts and really give you a nice way of seeing the activity across all of them. So when it comes to the telemetry itself, we're following a similar path as GuardDuty. So that means we're collecting VPC flow logs, CloudTrail management events, and GuardDuty findings. So at least that's the telemetry that we have to start with our initial release. And so also like GuardDuty, we manage the collection of the telemetry for you. So that means there's nothing for you to configure or turn on. If you're already using one of these sources, such as flow logs or CloudTrail, you continue to use them as is. You don't have to modify those configurations. We'll take care of handling collection for you, and we won't affect those. So, try to make it really simple for you to get going. Now on the GuardDuty findings, which we are also bringing in, we do collect those findings from accounts where GuardDuty is enabled. It isn't required. You certainly can have accounts that don't have GuardDuty enabled, and you can see in this case I've got an account up on the top right where we're collecting just the telemetry of CloudTrail and flow logs, and the other two accounts we're collecting all three. So while we certainly encourage our customers to turn on GuardDuty because it's not only just a great detection infrastructure, when we have the guard duty findings, we're also able to give you a lot of great context by synthesizing that finding data with the telemetry itself, and you can see how they correlate. Some really great insights that way. And it also enables a guard duty integration that I'm going to be showing in just a few minutes in the demo. So that's how the telemetry approach is handled. This data is constantly streaming in from all these accounts, and as it arrives, we are grabbing it and aggregating it into what we call here the security behavior graph here in the center. So let's take a closer look at the graph itself. Now, graph technology has become pretty popular in recent years. So if you're familiar with graphs, we're using what's called a property graph. And what that means is that data is collected into nodes, these or entities, some people call them, and relationships, or the edges on the graph, the kind of the connecting lines between them. And each of these have properties. And it's a pretty simple concept, but the reason we call this a security behavior graph is that we built our graph around the security professional. So that means the entities that are in our graph are really the resources or the things that you're investigating and asking questions about. Things like users or roles or instances, maybe even the findings. The relationships between those entities are how those items interacted. So did a user start an instance? What IP address did she look up? What role was used to access a bucket? So that's how we look at the model itself. So a nice abstract model. It allows us to bring in lots of different types of data. And in this particular picture, I'm only showing you a subset of the model. The actual abstract model has more entity types and certainly a lot more relationships on them, but hopefully this gives you an idea of the approach. Now, I mentioned it's a property graph, and that's that each of these nodes and edges have properties associated with them. So that means on the nodes themselves, let's take a user for example, you can get context about that user. So what's the name of the user? What roles are they using? What's the what instance is this looking at in this particular case? So this is the type of information you might otherwise be grabbing from multiple different systems, where you look in IAM or you might look in VPC flow, all these different places to try to grab that context. We're just bringing those properties together on the nodes. The same goes for properties on the relationships. So those connection points, you might decide to ask how many times has this call been made? Or what's the baseline of traffic that's flowing between these instances? Those are the properties of the relationships, and those are things that are going to help you answer the questions that you need answered very quickly. So hopefully this approach is easy to understand, certainly easy to explain, but it's a simple way of aggregating large volumes of data, and this is certainly important because as your AWS environments grow, they can generate a massive amount of telemetry. We are constantly adding more nodes and more relationships as all this telemetry arrives, so these graphs can get pretty big. In fact, we are certainly seeing in our customers today that it's easy to generate terabytes of data per day, so you can imagine how large these can get. Now, going back to the popularity of graphs, as I mentioned earlier, and sort of the visualization of graphs, there is a difference here when you're storing data this way versus just visualizing it. So this is more than just a picture of the data. We're actually storing this data on disk effectively that way so that we can ask these questions and arrange answers for you very quickly. It's not just about picturing things. It's about being able to identify these elements that are most important and being able to quickly give you the answers to those questions. The other really big benefit is that these graphs tend to be a fraction of the size of raw data, so that allows us to store these graphs for a very long period of time, and Gagan's going to talk to you a bit about that in just a moment. So while it is still tempting for people to want to see a graph or a graph visualization, to illustrate the point about why this is sometimes difficult, I've actually got a graph picture that I wanted to show you. So as an exercise, imagine that this graph showed, I don't know, instances and IPs and maybe the IP traffic flow between them. Imagine looking at a picture like this and trying to identify the interesting traffic flow between instances, or how much traffic is flowing between an IP and an instance, or whether that flow is normal or not. You can imagine that just looking at a graph is certainly interesting. You can certainly see the structure and how things are related. But when it comes to answering those questions that you have, the ones I just mentioned, when you're in the middle of a high priority alert investigation, it's really a lot, it's probably not the ideal way to be traversing through a graph and trying to ask questions of the graph. So that's why, in fact, we don't present data as a graph visualization, at least to start, because stay tuned, we'll be adding more capabilities in this space. But instead, we chose to present the graph like this. In this sense, it's much easier to see, well, this is the observed behavior or observed traffic between an IP address and an instance, and we can actually show you the volume. And we can even list the ones that we've seen so that you can order them and sort through them. It's a much easier way to consume the graph, and you're going to see the patterns. You're going to be able to answer your question much more quickly than if you had to traverse through a graph picture, as helpful as that might be for other uses. So this is just a preview. I'm going to show you real details of what this looks like in our console, but this is representative of the type of visualizations that we have in our graph. Okay, now I mentioned earlier about analytics, and oftentimes you hear a lot of buzzwords around machine learning and data science, and sometimes that can be either overwhelming or it makes us skeptical. So what we wanted to make sure you understand is that yes, we are powering these analytics with data science, and we have a team, in fact, of data scientists here as part of the Amazon Detective Service team. But we're not just trying to find the bad guy and saying, we found it, this is the answer. It's not quite that easy. What we are doing is applying our data science techniques to some really hard problems in this volumetric approach of looking at data. So if we want to understand if something is normal or not, there's a pretty significant problem on how do you baseline behaviors over long periods of time, especially given the types of data that we're looking at. And when you combine data sets, how do you look at these baselines? Or looking at the time series changes of some of the interactions or behaviors, doing that at scale and as data streams in can be challenging. So these are the types of problems that we are solving. We think they're very applicable, obviously, to what you're probably trying to accomplish today. And many of you might have done this. You probably have a team of folks that might be helping you, or maybe if you don't have a team, you've been looking for ways to introduce this type of analytic. These are the kind of things that we believe we can keep giving to you as part of the service. Almost think about us as additional staff on your team to be able to do this type of work. So what you see here are pictures from actually some of the research papers that our team has actually put together on these types of work. So much of this is actually groundbreaking research, but we don't want to present it necessarily in this way. I don't know about you. I'm not a data scientist, but these aren't always the best way for me to consume what that means. What's kind of the behind the scenes of this, of any particular analysis. So instead, what we do is we take those types of visualizations and we make them much more simple for you to understand. What these visualizations do is they're much more approachable for all your analysts. They're meant to be consumed by pretty much any skill level. And instead of looking at some of those more complex, the raw research level views, we're showing you the same data, but presenting it in ways that you can quickly see, here is the baseline, here is a pattern that has changed, here's an increase in flow. This is something that's above the baseline. Here's unexpected areas where you didn't see data before. And that makes it much easier for you to answer those questions that I was presenting earlier around the analytics. So if you want to see how much data was sent, and if it was normal, really simple to go find the baseline and see what percentage of this was above the baseline, and maybe even select that portion and see the pattern behind it. And if you wanted to see what it looked like just before or after an event, it's very simple to do. So this is the approach that we're going to continue to take, especially as we add in additional techniques, new approaches, and new algorithms. We're going to make sure that any one of those that we introduce will still be very consumable by your security analysts. So that's how the various components come together. And I thought what would make this come together even more is to take a few minutes to look at the console itself. So with that, we're going to do a quick demo here. All right, we're going to start here on the Detective homepage. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but just wanted to let you know we have a great landing place for you to understand things like pricing, some of the benefits, related resources. We also have a couple of areas here on the left side for you to do your account management. This is where you would look at adding member accounts and managing the telemetry collection. You can also get a great view of your usage, which is really important as you decide through your trial periods and looking at new accounts, what is the service going to cost you. So just wanted to start there just so you get a sense of sort of where that landing point is, but I'm going to come back to this. I have two scenarios I wanted to quickly go through. So we'll start with one I hinted earlier about the integration with GuardDuty, and this is a pretty common use case that we've been seeing across our customers. So what I'm going to do here is open up the GuardDuty console just briefly, just to give you a sense of how this integration works. This should be familiar to you, to those of you who are using GuardDuty already. But basically what's new is that in addition to being able to identify and filter your findings, you now have the ability to select them and drop down a new action, which is called Investigate. And by choosing the Investigate action, you're brought directly to the Detective console on what we call a finding profile. And I'm going to talk about profile pages in general, but hopefully what you just saw was a very simple way of fitting in Detective into your existing use of GuardDuty. And a little later we'll talk about some of the other opportunities for integration. We are doing this with Security Hub as well as a number of other partners. So we'll come back to that just a little later. Now I mentioned profile pages. This is sort of the design center of Detective, and that means that each thing that you're looking at, each entity or each resource has a collection of content, which is effectively the answers to questions that you might have about those things. So you'll see this repeated pattern where there is a page for each of these items, and they all vary. They're slightly different, but based on the type of entity. In this case, we're looking at findings. So findings are a little bit more about combining telemetry and insights that would help you disposition a finding. And we'll look at some resource profiles in just a moment. But the center of the console is probably where all the main kind of activity happens. You'll see that's sort of the place where all the content comes together. There are plenty of reminders about what you're looking at, including you're looking at a finding here, kind of descriptions of it. And then we try to organize content in ways that make it easy for you to see things at different perspectives. So in a finding like this, you can look at user-related content, you can look at the account-related content and see different aspects. Now just a couple of words around the tooling here. You'll notice this thing called scope time. Scope time is effectively the window of the graph that we're looking at for any part of your investigation. And there's typically some defaults for finding. It defaults to sort of the range of when you've seen this finding. For other entities, it might be the last 24 hours. But basically that time allows you to say if you wanted to look at the current period of time, you can see activity, or you can go in and change that time and look at different periods of time, maybe the last day, the last week, month, or even roll your own and go as far back as you'd like. So this is a great way for you to keep a specific view in mind, if you will, of the graph. And in fact, you can even lock that perspective. So as you're pivoting through the graph, you can move to other pages and maintain the window that you've selected. It's a really useful tool for helping your workflow. Now the content itself, there's various types. Some of them are the properties that I mentioned. So if you're looking at a finding, for example, we bring in some of the context about the finding. So things like the actual finding ID, when we saw it, the severity, what resources were involved, so the properties of that finding. We also, in this case, are bringing together properties of the affected resources. So you see information on users, maybe even the findings associated with those users. And then we also show a number of different types of behavior. So in some of them, there'll be things like overall behaviors that give you a sense of what's happening.
And in fact, many of these charts are meant to be very simple to understand. You'll see here, for example, we do things like showing you a baseline. This is your typical baseline of activity, and this is the recent activity in this window, this scope that we're looking at, and these are the actual activity bars that show action between this particular caller. But for things that might not always be obvious, we, for everything, provide links into an info link that gives you much more information. So if you want to understand how to interpret this particular graph, or you want to know about other questions it can answer for you, really simple for you to open up and see additional help information. That's available to you pretty much everywhere in the interface. Now, each of these visualizations has data behind them, obviously, but we also try to give you a little bit of look underneath what was the data that generated this chart. So if this case we're looking at call volume, and we can see where the calls were made, you can actually go and select these buckets of time where calls were made and look at the data underneath them. So in this case, I've selected this particular time bucket, and in a sense allow you to sort of drill down and see summary information about the data underneath it. Now, that data could come into different forms, so we give you access in different ways, and it also gives you might have different perspectives of how you'd like to attack it. So you might come in at the IP address, almost that as a dimension, and look at what did this IP do. You might look at an API dimension and say, what are the API methods that were called? In fact, while you're in there, you may even decide to filter that. So we have pretty easy ways of consuming the list of information. Some of these can have multiple pages, as you see. So you can do things like, well, let me just look at specific API methods that have to do with deletes. And what we'll do is pop those up, and you can filter out and just see, all right, there's one with deleting a trail. So really nice way of being able to understand what was the activity going on. You can imagine that this is important as you're trying to understand, was this finding a true positive or false positive? And if you caught the beginning of this, this is about a finding where a cloud trail has been disabled. So you might want to start understanding, well, why was it disabled? What was happening just before and after, etc. So that's the sort of context that we're providing. Each of the different tabs I mentioned have different types of analytics. So behavioral analytics that we show, things like where have you observed or not observed these calls coming from. We'll give you, views into the data like that. In this case, we're using a map. It's very visual for that type of analytic. But the same approach applies, where if you want to look at the data behind that particular region where you haven't seen something before, when you select it, the same drill down approach is available to you, and you can come in, look at the IP addresses, or maybe take a resource-oriented view and look at the roles or AKIDs that were making specific calls. So really trying to make sure that it's easy for you to look around these different tabs and understand what is it about these affected resources that might lead you to a disposition. So that's a typical approach. There are ways, pivot points on everything we do here. So you notice that as you look through this data, for example, when I clicked on this particular data, it says there's an IP address that was noted where this data came from. I can pivot on any one of these, open up a new tab, and be brought to a profile page for that other type. And so I can you can imagine as I look through the details of all these, I might see additional information that's interesting. I might see another finding that was interesting, or I might see another place I'd like to look at, additional resources about who was using it. Really easy to pivot across at any one of these linking points. Okay, so that was just a very quick view into how you might go from a guard duty finding and end up in detective, so that you can take a look at information that's going to help you disposition a finding. All right, so back to our console page, I wanted to show the other way that you might enter into the detective console. And it's a pretty simple way of being able to fit in questions that you might have in other systems about entities of interest. So you might have noticed on our homepage we have a search bar, a search function here. And in this space, we basically allow you to select any entity type or any object that you want to go investigate. So you notice that the list here shows the different types that are in the graph. As we add more telemetry, you'll be seeing additional types of these entities grow. But any one of these you can basically select and say, I'd like to look at an IP address or an instance. I have one in this case in mind, and enter that, and you're on your way for investigation. So I've actually prepared one as a quick scenario. We found what is a Bitcoin mining IP address. And so that might be an example where you just want to go and investigate and see what does detective know about this this IP address. And this is a great way to just insert that into the search bar, and you go directly to the profile page for this resource. Now, I didn't go into resource profile pages as much in the previous scenario, but very similar, as you can see. Again, the same reminders of what this page is about. So IP address. Here's the its actual address itself on top. We organize the data for IP addresses into overview again, behaviors and resource interactions, and then you can see things like what findings it's been involved in, etc. So it's a really nice way to kind of pivot across and see what's related. And in this case, one of the things that's really interesting for as you kind of scope out investigations is that you can go to the resource interaction pages, almost think of them as those links to other points in the graph, and you can see that this IP address, this Bitcoin mining, has associations with a number of instances in your organization. So this might be a case where this is a great list of items that during this activity period you might want to go investigate. So I can click on one of those, pivot over to the instance, and now I can see, again, I can start asking questions about, well, what was this instance for? Who created this, and was it created prior to the finding? Was it created after? I can get a sense of what flow, IP traffic flow from our VPC flow logs it's had, both on the inbound and outbound side. Even see things like this distinct counts and ports over time. So a really easy way for you to organize and ask questions about the various entities. And again, really simple way of integrating a search-based approach into your existing workflows. Now, I hinted that these aren't the only ways that we're seeing our customers use and integrate into our system. The guard duty approach is certainly being adopted in other of our partners, as well as Security Hub, other services. So we're making that approach available to you as a customer, so that you can link this in if you have a custom system that you'd like to provide this, as well as to our partners. And we're expanding the ecosystem partners where you'll see this integrate. So I'm going to hand it over to Gagan, who's going to talk a little bit more about that particular approach, and he'll give you a little bit more sense of where we see some of these use cases.
So Lewis walked us through the integration which Amazon Detective has with Amazon Guard Duty. We also have a similar integration with the AWS Security Hub. So when you're looking at Guard Duty findings within AWS Security Hub, you can easily pivot into the Amazon Detective interface and investigate and triage those findings. We envision that our customers who have a variety of different solutions, and they would like to have similar integrations from those solutions. So for instance, if you're collecting all of your findings in a SIM, or if you have a detection system that you're using that is surfacing findings or showing you resources to investigate, you can actually instrument those resources and those findings so that there are pivots into Amazon Detective, which show you information that would be helpful in figuring out whether the finding is a true positive or a false positive. It could be helpful in, for instance, the IP address investigation, which Lewis showed around Bitcoin mining, in conducting those sort of investigations and deep dives into the data that Amazon Detective has collected from CloudTrail and VPC flow logs. Similarly, on the right side, if you're using an orchestration system, that orchestration system may have steps that are semi-automated. It might be taking care of certain actions, but it might be prompting your SOC analyst to do certain things which require a manual step, which require looking at some of the data and understanding what happened. And those orchestration systems could, within their playbooks, provide deep links to Amazon Detective with the right context, so that the analyst doesn't waste any time in understanding that specific issue and figuring out what to do with that particular finding or investigation. Now, these integrations which we have with Guard Duty, with Security Hub, and with some of these, with the other tools that are available, are all made possible by a deep linking schema that Amazon Detective provides. The deep linking schema allows customers to come in not only for a particular resource, but also for specific time periods, and to also control and lock the time periods that the user sees as they go through Detective. We make this schema available, and it's something which we've seen customers basically can share within their team and also catalog as they come across interesting data and context for their investigations. We talked about some of the security solutions. One of the things that we've seen is that a lot of other security vendors see a great deal of value with the capabilities that Detective provides. And what we've done is we've basically the partners listed in the technology partners box here on the left. A lot of these partners have basically integrated their solutions with Amazon Detective out of the box. So if you use their solutions and you would like to use Detective for analyzing your cloud resources, you can do that very, very easily by talking to them and bringing in the components that facilitate that integration. In addition to these technology partners, we also have relationships with service partners. And what these partners have done is that they have developed best practices for triaging cloud security issues. They can help you integrate Detective within your own workflow so that you are best able to utilize Detective for resolving your issues. Additionally, some of these partners are also using Detective internally. So if you'd like them to take care of security issues on your behalf, you're able to do that. On getting started, we've set up Amazon Detective so that it's really easy for you to integrate. To enable, you can basically come to our console or use the control plane, the control plane API that we make available to enable Detective for your master account. The master account is basically the account that has rights to view data for not only itself, but also a set of other accounts that we call member accounts. So after you enable Detective for the master account, you can come into the console and add in all of these members. You could also upload a CSV file with a list of these members, or you could use our API to add these members. The setup process is very, very similar to Amazon GuardDuty and AWS Security Hub. So if you have previously set up those products, this is very, very similar to that. And one of the other things which we provided recently is also a set of scripts that facilitate not just the creation and enablement of Detective for one region, but you could do it for many regions basically by using that script in a CSV file. That's publicly available now. Louis mentioned that we are currently in preview. Our plan is to go into GA later this year. It should, current estimates are around Q1. One of the things which we will do when we go into GA is offer all of our customers a 30-day free trial. So you come in, you can enable Detective, and you can use it for 30 days and see the rich feature functionality and how well that integrates into your security operations. As a part of that, we offer a cost estimator which will show you, all the data that we are ingesting on behalf of your various accounts, and it would also project out a 30-day cost based upon those data volumes, so that you have a good idea of what Detective is going to cost your organization. Louis had briefly mentioned the baselines that Detective provides. In order to make Detective useful for you out of the box as soon as you enable it, one of the things that we do is that we ingest 2 weeks of historical information for the master and all the member accounts as soon as you turn Detective on. So soon after you enable Detective, when you go into the Detective console, you will see those GuardDuty findings, the VPC flow information, as well as the CloudTrail management events that have occurred over the last 2 weeks. So you get some amount of value day one. So let me tell you about Amazon Detective's pricing model. The pricing listed here is for the US East region. Amazon Detective basically prices based upon the total ingested data volume across all of our data sources. I mentioned the data sources previously, but we've established this pricing because we envisioned bringing in additional sources of telemetry. And The way the pricing is set up is that for the first terabyte of information, we charge $2 per gigabyte. For the next 4 terabytes of information, we charge $1 per gigabyte. For the next 5 terabytes of information, it's 50 cents a gigabyte. And then after that, it is 25 cents per gigabyte. The way this pricing is set up, it is, an example of this would be that if we ingest 10 terabytes for you over the course of a month, it would cost you $8,500 per month. Also, another thing I want to point out with the pricing is that we roll a pricing at the pair account level. So if you have multiple accounts set up in Detective and you have the same pair, we will basically collect the pricing tier which we charge you on is based upon the total amount of storage that we ingest across all those accounts which roll into the same pair account. And again, the pricing is for storing the graph data for 1 year, and then after that we basically age off the older data. We are currently in preview, and in preview we are available in 5 regions. We are available in North Virginia, Ohio, Oregon, Ireland, and Tokyo. When we roll out into GA later this year, we will be available in all commercial regions. During the course of the preview, we do envision adding on other regions. I definitely encourage you to come in, check out our website. We have put up a lot of great information about Amazon Detective there. We are bringing on customers into the preview program in stages. So if you're interested and if Detective can help your security operations, I really encourage you to sign up for the preview program, and we'll get back to you regarding when we can bring you on. And please, feel free to reach out if you have any questions.